In Maple Ridge, Vermont, a 58-year-old widow was about to face devastating family criticism. What started as Thanksgiving dinner took a shocking turn when her son dismissed her cooking as outdated museum pieces. Eleanor Hartwell wasn't your typical homemaker. For decades, she had perfected Depression-era recipes, known for preserving 4 generations of culinary wisdom. When Michael casually destroyed her life's work with cruel words, she had no idea this moment would spark an entrepreneurial revolution. Ellie made a decision that would transform her entire community. What began as family humiliation became Hartwell's kitchen, proving some traditions are too powerful to dismiss. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The maple table groaned under the weight of tradition. Eleanor Hartwell had risen before dawn to prepare the feast that now spread across her grandmother's handcrafted dining table, the same table where 4 generations of Hartwell women had served Thanksgiving dinner. Steam rose from the turkey, its skin bronzed to perfection with butter and herbs her grandmother had taught her to rub beneath the surface. The cranberry sauce, made from berries she'd picked herself along the edge of Miller's Pond, gleamed like rubies in the cut-glass bowl that had belonged to her mother-in-law. Sweet potato casserole crowned with golden marshmallows sat beside green bean casserole made exactly as it appeared on the index card written in her grandmother's careful script. The paper now soft as cloth from decades of handling. Ellie paused in the kitchen doorway, wiping her hands on the apron that bore the faint stains of 35 years of family meals. At 58, she moved with the practiced efficiency of a woman who had spent her entire adult life orchestrating these moments, the careful timing that ensured everything emerged from the oven at precisely the right temperature, the way she could sense when the gravy needed another minute of whisking, the instinct that told her to start the rolls exactly 20 minutes before the turkey finished resting. "Mom, this looks incredible," Tommy called from his seat at the far end of the table. Her younger son had arrived that morning with sawdust still caught in his dark hair and the easy smile that reminded her so much of his father. At 29, Tommy possessed the kind of contentment that came from never needing to prove anything to anyone. He carved wood into furniture that would outlast them all, played guitar at the local coffee shop on Friday nights, and had never once suggested that his mother's life needed improvement. Michael, by contrast, checked his phone between bites and wore the restless energy of someone always half present. Her older son had driven up from Boston the night before, his BMW looking absurdly sleek parked next to Tommy's battered pickup truck. Even now, as Ellie placed the final dish on the table, Michael's attention seemed divided between the meal and whatever urgent email demanded his attention. "The presentation is a bit rustic, isn't it?" Michael said, finally setting his phone aside. He surveyed the table with the critical eye he'd developed during his years working for a high-end marketing firm. "I mean, it's fine for family, but have you seen what they're doing with traditional recipes in Boston? There's this place in the North End that does a deconstructed turkey dinner. All the same flavors, but presented in a way that feels contemporary." Ellie settled into her chair, the same chair she'd occupied for decades, positioned so she could easily jump up if anyone needed seconds or wanted another roll from the warming basket. "I've always made it this way," she said quietly. "The way Grandma Rose taught me." "Right, but that's kind of my point." Michael reached for the wine he'd brought, something expensive with a French name that none of them could pronounce. "These recipes are what, from the 1940s? Maybe earlier? Food has evolved since then. People expect more sophistication now, more creativity." Tommy's fork paused halfway to his mouth. "What's wrong with the way Mom cooks?" "Nothing's wrong with it," Michael said quickly, though his tone suggested otherwise. "It's just outdated. Like, when was the last time you saw green bean casserole on a restaurant menu? Or sweet potato casserole with marshmallows? It's very Betty Crocker, very 1950s housewife." The words hit Ellie like a physical blow. She felt her chest tighten as the familiar sensation of shrinking inward took hold. The same feeling she'd experienced whenever Henry's colleagues' wives discussed their careers, their travels, their lives that seemed so much more significant than her quiet existence as a homemaker and part-time librarian. "Mom's food is amazing," Tommy said, his voice carrying an edge now. "Remember when you brought Sarah up here for Christmas 2 years ago? She couldn't stop talking about Mom's cooking. She asked for the stuffing recipe." "Sarah was being polite," Michael replied, cutting his turkey with surgical precision. "Look, I'm not trying to be critical. I just think Mom could benefit from expanding her horizons. There are cooking classes, YouTube channels, food blogs. She could learn some modern techniques, maybe fusion approaches, Asian-inspired cranberry sauce, or turkey roulade instead of the whole bird." "Why would I want to change something that's been in our family for generations?" Ellie asked, though her voice sounded smaller than she intended. Michael leaned back in his chair, warming to his subject in the way he did when presenting a marketing strategy to clients. "Because traditions can become traps, Mom. You've been making the same meal the same way for 30 years. Where's the growth? Where's the creativity? You're stuck in this bubble where you think the old ways are automatically the best ways." Ellie's hands trembled slightly as she reached for her water glass. She could feel the familiar burn of tears threatening, the shame that came with being made to feel foolish for something that had always brought her joy and purpose. "She's not stuck," Tommy said, his voice rising slightly. "She's preserving something important. Do you know how many families have lost their traditional recipes because nobody bothered to learn them? Mom carries all of Grandma Rose's knowledge." "And that's sweet," Michael said, his tone patronizing enough to make Tommy's jaw clench. "But knowledge needs to evolve. Otherwise, it just becomes quaint, like a museum exhibit." The comparison stung more than anything else he'd said. Ellie rose abruptly from her chair, mumbling something about checking on the pies. She escaped to the kitchen where she gripped the edge of the counter, fighting back tears that seemed to come from a place deeper than hurt feelings. Through the dining room doorway, she could hear Tommy's voice, tight with anger. "That was a shitty thing to say." "What? I'm trying to help her. Mom's been in this house doing the same things the same way since Dad died. She needs to get out there, try new things, meet new people. Cooking classes could be a great place to start. Maybe she doesn't want to change. Maybe what she does matters exactly as it is." "You're as stuck as she is," Michael shot back. "When was the last time either of you traveled anywhere? Tried anything new? You're both living in this little Vermont bubble where everything's exactly like it was in 1985. Ellie pressed her palms against her eyes, trying to stop the tears that felt inevitable. She thought about her grandmother Rose, who had run a boarding house during World War II, feeding dozens of guests with recipes passed down from her own mother. Rose had never questioned whether her food was sophisticated enough or contemporary enough. She had simply cooked with love and skill, trusting that nourishment mattered more than novelty. The conversation in the dining room continued, but Ellie couldn't bear to listen anymore. She busied herself with wrapping leftovers, her movements automatic and soothing. When her sons finally appeared in the kitchen doorway, she managed a brittle smile. "Pies are cooling," she announced, as if the previous conversation hadn't happened. "Should be ready in about 20 minutes. Michael approached her cautiously, perhaps sensing he'd crossed a line. "Mom, I didn't mean to upset you. I just worry that you're not challenging yourself anymore." "I'm fine," Ellie replied, the response she'd perfected over decades of marriage whenever Henry came home frustrated from work and needed someone to absorb his mood. "The recipes are fine. Everything's fine." But as she hugged her sons goodbye, an hour later, as she listened to Michael's BMW disappear down the mountain road and Tommy's truck rumble to life, Ellie knew that nothing was fine. She stood in her doorway watching their taillights vanish into the November darkness, feeling more alone than she had since Henry's funeral. The house felt cavernous as she returned to the kitchen, Dirty dishes filled the sink, and the rich smells of the feast she'd spent days preparing now seemed to mock her. She gathered the serving platters mechanically, scraping uneaten food into containers, her mind replaying every word of Michael's dismissal. Outdated. Betty Crocker. Museum exhibit. When the dishes were finally clean and the kitchen restored to order, Ellie found herself standing before the old wooden recipe box that sat on the counter beside the coffee maker. Her grandmother's handwriting covered dozens of index cards, the paper yellowed with age and splattered with decades of use. Here was Rose's famous apple pie recipe, written in the careful script of a woman who'd learned to write by candlelight. Here were the instructions for Christmas cookies that had delighted 4 generations of children, for the soup that could cure any winter cold, for the bread that had sustained her family through the Great Depression. Ellie pulled out the card for her grandmother's turkey stuffing, the same recipe she'd used today, the one Michael had dismissed as outdated. Rose's notes filled the margins. Add extra sage if weather is damp, and sausage from Muller's gives best flavor, and remember, stuffing made with love never fails. The tears came then, hot and angry and long overdue. Not just for tonight's humiliation, but for every time she'd been made to feel invisible, irrelevant, stuck in the past. For every well-meaning comment about how she should get out there and try new things as if her life, her knowledge, her skills, her traditions were somehow insufficient. As she sat at her kitchen table holding her grandmother's recipe cards, Ellie felt something shift inside her chest. Not the familiar shrinking sensation she'd grown accustomed to, but something harder and more determined. Michael thought her recipes were outdated museum pieces, that her cooking belonged in the past rather than the present. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand and reached for the notepad she kept by the phone. At the top of a clean page, she wrote in careful letters, Hartwell's Kitchen, Traditional Vermont Recipes. If her food was too old-fashioned for her own son's refined palate, perhaps there were others who would appreciate the kind of cooking that came from the heart rather than a cookbook, from generations of knowledge rather than the latest food trend. Perhaps it was time to find out exactly how outdated her grandmother's recipes really were. The decision felt both terrifying and inevitable, like stepping off a cliff she hadn't realized she'd been standing on. But as Ellie sat in her quiet kitchen, surrounded by the lingering warmth of the day's cooking, she felt something she hadn't experienced in years, the spark of possibility. Tomorrow, she would start making calls. She would find out what it took to open a small restaurant in Maple Ridge. She would prove that some traditions were worth preserving, worth celebrating, worth far more than Michael's casual dismissal. She would show him, show everyone, that Eleanor Hartwell and her grandmother's recipes were anything but outdated. The notepad still lay open on Ellie's kitchen table the next morning, her careful handwriting staring back at her in the pale November light. Hartwell's Kitchen, Traditional Vermont Recipes. The words looked both bold and absurd in the harsh reality of daylight. What did she know about running a restaurant? She'd never even waitressed, let alone managed a kitchen for paying customers. The coffee maker gurgled to life as she moved through her morning routine, muscle memory carrying her through the motions while her mind raced with questions. How much money would she need? Where would she find a location? Did Maple Ridge even want another restaurant? The doubt crept in like frost on windows, threatening to freeze her resolve before it could take root. By noon, she found herself walking down Main Street toward Maggie's yarn shop, needing the comfort of her oldest friend's practical wisdom. The November air bit at her cheeks, but the familiar rhythm of her footsteps on the cracked sidewalk soothed her nerves. Maple Ridge hadn't changed much in the 30 years she'd called it home. The same weathered storefronts, the same hand-painted signs swaying in the mountain breeze, the same sense that time moved differently here than in the rest of the world. The bell above Maggie's door chimed as Ellie entered, breathing in the familiar scent of wool and lavender sachets. Margaret Thornton sat behind the counter, her silver hair twisted into its usual no-nonsense bun, reading glasses perched on the end of her nose as she worked on inventory. At 71, Maggie possessed the kind of sharp-eyed pragmatism that came from running a business through economic downturns, changing trends, and the endless challenges of small-town commerce. "You look like someone who's been wrestling with angels all night," Maggie observed without looking up from her clipboard. "Coffee's fresh if you want some." Ellie poured herself a cup from the pot Maggie kept for customers and settled into the worn armchair beside the counter. The familiar ritual of sharing morning coffee with her friend had sustained them both through marriages, child-rearing, and in Ellie's case, widowhood. "I'm thinking about opening a restaurant," Ellie said, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. Maggie's pen paused mid-calculation. She looked up slowly, studying Ellie's face with the intensity of someone who'd known her since they were 12 years old and had learned to read the subtle signs of serious intent versus passing fancy. "This wouldn't have anything to do with whatever happened at Thanksgiving dinner, would it?" Maggie asked. "Tommy stopped by yesterday afternoon looking like someone had kicked his dog. Said Michael was being an ass about your cooking." The relief of being understood without having to explain flooded through Ellie. She found herself telling Maggie everything. Michael's dismissive comments, the hurt that had cut deeper than she'd expected, the way she'd sat in her kitchen holding her grandmother's recipe cards and felt something fundamental shift inside her. Maggie listened without interruption, occasionally nodding or making small sounds of sympathy. When Ellie finished, her friend set down her clipboard and fixed her with a steady gaze. "First question," Maggie said. "Are you doing this to prove something to Michael, or because you actually want to run a restaurant?" The question hit like cold water. Ellie opened her mouth to answer, then closed it, realizing she wasn't entirely sure. The hurt and anger were still fresh, still driving much of her motivation. But underneath those emotions lay something else, a longing she'd barely acknowledged. "I think," Ellie began slowly, "I think I've been invisible for so long that I forgot I had anything worth showing. When Michael called my cooking outdated, it felt like he was calling me outdated. Like everything I've learned, everything I've preserved, doesn't matter anymore. And opening a restaurant would prove it does matter. Maybe, or maybe it would prove that I matter." The admission surprised Ellie with its honesty. "I've been Henry's wife, then the boy's mother, then the town librarian. I don't know if I've ever been just me." Maggie nodded slowly. "That's a better reason than spite, though spite can be good fuel in the short term." She leaned forward, her expression becoming businesslike. "But Ellie, running a restaurant isn't just about cooking. It's permits and health inspectors and profit margins and staff scheduling. It's 16-hour days and never knowing if you'll make rent. Are you prepared for that?" The practical questions hit Ellie like a checklist of her own ignorance. She knew how to cook for a family, how to manage a household budget, how to organize a church potluck for 50 people. But a real restaurant, with paying customers who expected consistency and professionalism? "I don't know," she admitted. "I don't know anything about the business side, but I know food, Maggie. I know how to make people feel cared for through cooking. That has to count for something." "It counts for everything," Maggie said firmly. "But it's not enough by itself. You'll need a business plan, startup capital, a location. You'll need to understand food costs and portion control and—" She stopped, seeing the overwhelm creeping into Ellie's expression. "But you don't need to know everything today. You just need to know if you're serious enough to start learning." As if summoned by their conversation, the shop door chimed again. A young woman with short dark hair and tired eyes entered, scanning the yarn displays with the distracted air of someone killing time rather than shopping with purpose. Ellie recognized her vaguely, one of the Rodriguez girls who'd moved away for college and career opportunities in bigger cities. "Ruby Chen," Maggie called out. "Haven't seen you in town for a while." The woman looked up, startled. "Oh, hi, Mrs. Thornton. I'm actually back permanently now. Moved home during the pandemic and decided to stay." I run a food blog called Mountain Flavors, focusing on Vermont restaurants and local food culture. Ellie felt something spark in her chest. A food blogger. Someone who understood the restaurant world, who might know about permits and health, inspectors and all the practical details that seemed so overwhelming. Ellie here is thinking about opening a restaurant, Maggie said with the subtle mischief of someone who knew exactly what she was doing. Traditional Vermont recipes, her grandmother's cooking. Ruby's interest sharpened immediately. Really? What kind of traditional recipes? There's such a movement right now toward authentic regional cuisine. People are tired of fusion and molecular gastronomy. They want food that tells a story. The conversation that followed felt like stepping through a door Ellie hadn't known existed. Ruby spoke about the restaurant landscape in Vermont, about the challenges facing small establishments, but also about the growing appreciation for authentic local cuisine. She mentioned food tourism, social media marketing, the importance of having a clear concept and story. The thing is, Ruby said, warming to her subject, Vermont has this incredible culinary heritage that's been overshadowed by farm-to-table trends and craft brewery culture. If someone could really showcase traditional Vermont cooking, the recipes that sustained families through hard winters, the dishes that defined community gatherings, that could be something special. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. By the time Ruby left the shop an hour later, she'd exchanged phone numbers with Ellie and promised to send her information about restaurant licensing requirements and local suppliers. Ellie felt both excited and terrified, as if she'd accidentally stepped onto a moving train. Well, Maggie said, returning to her inventory with satisfaction. Looks like you've got yourself a consultant. That evening, Ellie sat at her kitchen table with a legal pad and her grandmother's recipe box, making lists. Questions to research, people to call, steps to take. The practical reality of her impulse was becoming clearer, more daunting but also more concrete. When Tommy's truck pulled into her driveway just after sunset, she felt grateful for the interruption. Her younger son appeared at her kitchen door with a container of leftover turkey soup and the easy smile that always lifted her spirits. Thought, "You might want some company," he said, settling into the chair across from her. His eyes fell on the legal pad covered with her notes. "What's all this?" Ellie found herself explaining her restaurant idea to Tommy, watching his expression shift from surprise to thoughtful consideration. Unlike Michael, Tommy didn't immediately point out the obstacles or suggest she wasn't qualified. Instead, he asked about her vision, about what kind of atmosphere she imagined, about whether she'd considered where she might want to locate such a place. "You know," he said finally, "the old Miller's hardware building has been empty for 2 years. Perfect size for a small restaurant, and Mrs. Miller's been looking for the right tenant. Someone who'd respect the building's character." The idea of a specific location made everything feel suddenly real. Ellie could picture it. Warm light spilling from the old hardware store's windows, the smell of her grandmother's cooking drawing people in from the cold Vermont night, tables filled, with neighbors and strangers alike, discovering the comfort of traditional food prepared with love. "Tommy," she said quietly, "do you think I'm crazy?" Her son reached across the table and covered her hand with his work-roughened fingers. "I think you're the sanest person I know, and I think Grandma Rose would be proud as hell." As Tommy left that night, promising to stop by Miller's Hardware the next day to get Mrs. Miller's contact information, Ellie felt the first real surge of possibility. The restaurant was still just an idea, still fraught with uncertainty and practical challenges. But for the first time in years, she was moving toward something rather than simply maintaining what already existed. The thought was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. In her kitchen, surrounded by the lingering warmth of the days, conversations, and the quiet confidence of her grandmother's recipes, Eleanor Hartwell began to believe that some dreams were worth the risk of failure. The brass nameplate on Frank Morrison's desk read, commercial lending manager, but Ellie knew him simply as the man who'd handled her mortgage refinancing after Henry died. At 62, Frank carried himself with the careful dignity of someone who'd spent decades saying no to people's dreams while wishing he could say yes more often. His office at First National Bank of Vermont felt formal and intimidating, all dark wood and leather chairs that made Ellie acutely aware of her worn winter coat and nervous energy. "Mrs. Hartwell," Frank said, gesturing to the chair across from his desk. "Tommy mentioned you were interested in discussing a business loan." Ellie settled into the chair, clutching the folder she'd assembled over the past week, printouts from Ruby's emails about restaurant requirements, notes from her conversation with Mrs. Miller about the hardware store building, and her grandmother's recipe box, which she'd brought more for moral support than practical purposes. "I want to open a small restaurant," she said, the words feeling both foreign and natural on her tongue. "Traditional Vermont cooking, family recipes." Frank's expression remained professionally neutral, but Ellie caught something in his eyes, a flicker of interest, or perhaps sympathy. He'd been widowed himself 3 years prior, she remembered. Cancer had taken his wife Sarah after 40. Years of marriage, leaving him with the same hollow feeling of purposelessness that Ellie knew too well. "What kind of investment are we talking about?" Frank asked, pulling out a yellow legal pad. "Have you developed a business plan? Projected startup costs?" The questions hit like a foreign language. Business plan? Projected costs? Ellie opened her folder and spread out the papers she'd gathered, suddenly aware of how amateur her research looked compared to the thick loan applications she'd seen other people carrying into this office. "I've been researching the requirements," she said, trying to project more confidence than she felt. "Ruby Chen, she runs a food blog, sent me information about licensing and permits, and I know the Miller's hardware building is available for lease." Frank picked up one of Ruby's printouts, scanning the information with practiced efficiency. "This is helpful preliminary research," he said carefully, "but banks need to see comprehensive financial projections, equipment costs, renovation expenses, working capital requirements, revenue forecasts based on realistic customer traffic." Each item on his list felt like another mountain to climb. Ellie had thought the hardest part would be deciding to pursue her dream. She hadn't anticipated the maze of paperwork and planning that stood between intention and reality. "I have some savings," she offered weakly, "from Henry's life insurance and the house refinancing." "That's good," Frank said, his tone gentler now. "But we'll need to know exactly how much and how it breaks down against startup costs versus operating expenses for the first year." He leaned back in his chair, studying her face. "Mrs. Hartwell, Ellie, can I ask what's driving this? You've lived in Maple Ridge for 30 years. Why a restaurant now?" The personal question caught her off guard. She'd expected forms and financial requirements, not an inquiry into her motivations. But something in Frank's expression, perhaps the recognition of someone else who'd been forced to rebuild their life after loss, made her want to answer honestly. "My son thinks my cooking is outdated," she said quietly. "He called my grandmother's recipes museum pieces, and I realized I've been letting myself become invisible for so long that maybe I started believing it was true." Frank nodded slowly, understanding flickering in his eyes. "Sarah used to say that grief makes us smaller if we let it, makes us think we don't deserve to take up space anymore." The unexpected vulnerability in his voice created a bridge between them. This wasn't just a loan officer evaluating risk. This was one widowed person recognizing another's need to prove their continued relevance in the world. "The thing is," Frank continued, "banks aren't in the business of funding therapy. We need to see that you understand what you're getting into." He pulled out a thick folder from his desk drawer. "But that doesn't mean the dream isn't worth pursuing. It just means we need to do the homework." For the next hour, Frank walked Ellie through the basics of restaurant financing. Equipment leasing versus purchasing, the importance of location analysis and demographic studies, cash flow projections, and break-even calculations. By the time he finished, Ellie's head was spinning with terminology she'd never considered. "This is a lot," she admitted, staring at the business plan template he'd printed for her. "It is," Frank agreed. "But you're not starting from nothing. You have a concept, a potential location, and genuine culinary skills. That's more than many people who walk through that door." He hesitated, then added, "And you have something else that's harder to quantify but equally important." "What's that?" "A story worth telling." People don't just buy food, Ellie. They buy experiences, memories, connections to something authentic. If you can learn the business side, and I believe you can, the rest might just take care of itself. As Ellie gathered her papers to leave, Frank handed her his business card. Written on the back in his careful handwriting was a phone number. "That's my direct line," he said. "Call me when you've worked through the business plan template. Or if you have questions along the way. This doesn't have to be a journey you take alone." Walking back to her car, Ellie felt overwhelmed, but not defeated. The mountain of requirements ahead seemed impossibly steep, but Frank's support had given her something she hadn't expected: hope that someone in the professional world saw potential in her dream. Her phone buzzed with a text from Ruby. "Coffee tomorrow? I have ideas about your concept that might help with the business plan." As Ellie drove home through the familiar streets of Maple Ridge, she found herself looking at the town differently. Not just as the place where she'd raised her children and mourned her husband, but as a community that might welcome what she had to offer. The Miller's Hardware building sat empty on Main Street, its dark windows reflecting the late afternoon light like a promise waiting to be fulfilled. That evening, she spread Frank's business plan template across her kitchen table, her grandmother's, recipes beside it like a talisman. The questions seemed endless: target market analysis, competitive landscape assessment, staffing plans. But each section also felt like a step toward making her dream tangible. The work ahead would be harder than anything she'd attempted since learning to live alone after Henry's death. But as she began filling in the first sections of the plan, Ellie discovered something surprising. She was looking forward to the challenge. For the first time in years, she had a future worth planning for. The Miller's Hardware building stood like a sleeping giant on Main Street, its weathered brick facade and tall windows speaking of better days when the town's commercial district thrived with local businesses. Ellie stood on the sidewalk with Tommy, studying the for lease sign that had become as familiar as furniture over the past 2 years. Inside, she could see the ghost outlines of old shelving units on the walls and the worn wooden floors that had supported decades of commerce. "Mrs. Miller said she'd meet us here at 10, Tommy said, checking his watch. His breath formed small clouds in the December air as he surveyed the building with a carpenter's eye. "She's been pretty selective about tenants. Turned down 3. Chain stores already." The bell tower of the Presbyterian Church chimed the hour just as a burgundy Buick pulled up to the curb. Helen Miller emerged slowly, a woman in her 80s who moved with the careful dignity of someone who'd outlived most of her contemporaries. She'd run the hardware store with her late husband for 47 years before finally closing it, when the big box stores made small-town hardware obsolete. "Eleanor Hartwell," Mrs. Miller said warmly, extending a gloved hand. "I remember when you first moved to town. Seems like yesterday you were chasing those boys of yours out of my store for touching everything they could reach." The memory brought an unexpected smile to Ellie's face. "Tommy was convinced you kept candy behind the paint counter." "Smart boy, I did." Mrs. Miller's eyes twinkled as she unlocked the heavy wooden door, reserved for children who asked politely instead of grabbing. The interior of the building felt cavernous after standing empty for so long, but Ellie could immediately envision the possibilities. The main floor was divided into 2 large rooms, perfect for dining areas, with high ceilings that would accommodate both intimate conversations and larger gatherings. The back room, where Miller's had stored bulk inventory, could easily house a commercial kitchen. Beautiful tin ceiling, Tommy observed, running his hand along one of the pressed metal tiles. Original 1890s. We could restore these to look spectacular. Mrs. Miller led them through the space, pointing out the electrical updates her husband had made in the 1990s and the solid foundation that had weathered more than a century of Vermont winters. The upstairs was always storage, but it could be converted to office space or even a small apartment if someone wanted to live above their business. As they explored, Ellie felt the same sensation she'd experienced holding her grandmother's recipe cards, a sense of rightness, of pieces, clicking into place. The building had good bones, honest character, and enough space to accommodate her vision without overwhelming her limited resources. "What kind of restaurant are you planning?" Mrs. Miller asked as they stood in what would become the main dining room. "Traditional Vermont cooking," Ellie replied. "My grandmother's recipes from the 1940s. Comfort food, family-style service. Nothing fancy, just honest food prepared with care." Mrs. Miller nodded approvingly. "Rose Hartwell's granddaughter. I should have realized. Your grandmother made the best apple pie in 3 counties. Used to bring them to every church social and community fundraiser." The unexpected connection to her grandmother felt like a blessing. But before Ellie could respond, Tommy's phone buzzed with an incoming call. "It's Patricia Weston," he said, glancing at the screen. "The councilwoman. She wants to meet with you about your restaurant plans." Mrs. Miller's expression shifted subtly, a shadow crossing her features. Patricia's been quite vocal about her vision for downtown revitalization lately. An hour later, Ellie found herself in the town hall conference room, facing Councilwoman Patricia Weston across a polished table scattered with development proposals and architectural renderings. At 55, Patricia projected the kind of polished authority that came from years in local politics and successful property management. Her blonde hair was perfectly styled, her suit expensive enough to signal status in a town where most people shopped at the outlets in Manchester. "Mrs. Hartwell," Patricia began, her tone cordial but businesslike. "I understand you're considering opening a restaurant in the Miller Building." "That's right," Ellie replied, suddenly conscious of her own appearance. Her practical wool coat, her sensible shoes, her complete lack of the professional polish that Patricia wore like armor. Patricia spread out several glossy brochures featuring upscale restaurants from other Vermont towns. "I'm sure you're aware that Maple Ridge is at a critical juncture in our economic development. We have an opportunity to position ourselves as a destination for discerning tourists and seasonal residents, the kind of people who drive up property values and support quality businesses." Ellie studied the brochures, noting the sleek, modern interiors, the fusion menus featuring local ingredients prepared with molecular gastronomy techniques, the wine lists that read like investment portfolios. "These establishments represent the direction we need to move," Patricia continued. "Sophisticated dining experiences that reflect modern Vermont's evolution from rural farming community to upscale retreat destination." The implication hung in the air like a challenge. Ellie's traditional cooking didn't fit the sophisticated image Patricia was promoting. Her grandmother's recipes belonged to the past, not the carefully curated future the councilwoman envisioned. "I appreciate your concern for the town's economic development," Ellie said carefully. "But I think there's room for different kinds of restaurants. Not everyone wants molecular gastronomy with their dinner." Patricia's smile remained fixed, but her eyes hardened slightly. "Of course there's value in traditional approaches, but we need to be strategic about how we present Maple Ridge to the outside world. First impressions matter enormously in tourism and real estate." The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, with Patricia presenting statistics about tourist spending patterns and demographic data about their target market. Every number reinforced the same message. Ellie's concept didn't align with the town's economic aspirations. As Ellie walked back to her car, she felt the familiar sensation of being dismissed, of having her ideas evaluated and found wanting. But this time, instead of shrinking inward, she found herself getting angry. Who was Patricia Weston to decide what kind of restaurant Maple Ridge needed? Who appointed her the arbiter of what represented the town's best interests? Her phone rang as she reached her car. Ruby Chen's voice was excited, breathless. "Ellie, I just got off the phone with the most amazing young chef, Samantha Rodriguez. She goes by Sam. She just moved back to Vermont after working in New York. City kitchens, and she's looking for opportunities. I told her about your concept, and she's completely intrigued by traditional Vermont cooking techniques." The timing felt like providence. "When can I meet her?" "She's actually working a shift at the diner right now, trying to make ends meet while she figures out her next move." "Why don't you stop by for coffee? I'll text her that you're coming." 20 minutes later, Ellie sat in a booth at Murphy's Diner, watching a young woman with efficient movements and tired eyes work behind the counter. Sam Rodriguez moved through the cramped kitchen with the fluid precision of someone trained in professional food service, but Ellie could see the frustration in her posture, the way she checked the clock, the resigned expression when orders came back for minor modifications. When Sam's shift ended, she slid into the booth across from Ellie, her dark hair escaping from its ponytail and her chef's coat bearing the inevitable stains of short-order cooking. "Ruby says you're planning a restaurant featuring traditional Vermont recipes," Sam said without preamble. "I have to admit, after 18 months in New York kitchens trying to master foam and spherification, the idea of honest, straightforward cooking sounds like a relief." They talked for an hour, with Sam describing her culinary school training and her experience in high-pressure urban kitchens, while Ellie shared her vision for Hartwell's kitchen and the recipes that had inspired it. By the time they parted ways, they'd arranged for Sam to come to Ellie's house the following weekend to cook together and explore how traditional techniques might translate to restaurant service. Driving home, Ellie felt energized despite the morning's encounter with Patricia Weston. She had a building owner who appreciated her concept, a potential chef who understood both traditional and modern approaches, and growing support from people who saw value in preserving authentic local culture. The opposition she'd face was real: political pressure, financial challenges, the skepticism of those who saw tradition as an obstacle to progress. But for the first time since this journey began, Ellie felt like she was assembling a team of people who believed in her vision. The phone call from Frank Morrison that evening confirmed her growing confidence. "I've been thinking about our conversation," he said. "And I've been doing some research on restaurant success rates in small Vermont towns. The numbers are better than I expected, especially for establishments with strong local connections and authentic concepts." As Ellie fell asleep that night, she pictured the Miller building filled with warm light and the sounds of conversation, the smell of her grandmother's cooking drawing people in from the cold December night. The challenges ahead were real, but so was the possibility of creating something meaningful. Patricia Weston's vision of sophisticated dining might appeal to wealthy tourists, but Ellie was beginning to understand that her restaurant could serve a different but equally important purpose: preserving the authentic heart of a community that risked losing itself in the pursuit of outside approval. The sound of Tommy's hammer echoed through the Miller building like a heartbeat, steady and purposeful as he worked to remove decades of accumulated hardware store fixtures. Ellie stood in what would become the main dining room, holding her grandmother's cast-iron skillet and trying to envision 20 tables filled with neighbors sharing meals that connected them to their shared history. "The good news is the bones are solid," Tommy called from across the room where he was carefully prying away old shelving brackets. "Bad news is we're going to need new electrical in the kitchen area, and the plumbing hasn't been updated since the Carter administration." Sam Rodriguez emerged from the back room where she'd been measuring space for commercial equipment, her notebook filled with sketches and calculations. At 24, she moved with the confident efficiency of someone who'd learned to maximize every inch of kitchen real estate in cramped New York restaurants. But Ellie had noticed how Sam's eyes lit up when they discussed traditional Vermont cooking techniques, the slow braising methods that coaxed maximum flavor from tough cuts of meat, the art of making gravy from pan drippings that her grandmother had perfected during the Depression. "We could fit a 6-burner range here," Sam said, pointing to the far wall of the back room, "with a prep station along this wall and a pass-through window to the dining room. If we're smart about the layout, we can handle dinner service for 40 covers without killing ourselves." 40 covers. The restaurant terminology still felt foreign in Ellie's mouth, but she was learning. Sam had spent the past 2 weeks teaching her the language of professional cooking, covers instead of customers, mise en place instead of preparation, the crucial importance of timing and efficiency that separated home cooking from restaurant service. The front door chimed as Frank Morrison entered, carrying 2 coffee cups from the shop down the street, and wearing the kind of satisfied expression that suggested good news. Over the past month, their relationship had evolved beyond banker and loan applicant into something warmer, though neither had explicitly acknowledged the shift. Frank had taken to stopping by the renovation site most afternoons, ostensibly to check on the progress, but increasingly to simply spend time in Ellie's company. "Permits came through," he announced, handing Ellie one of the coffees. "Health department inspection is scheduled for next week, and the fire marshal signed off on your seating plan." The relief that flooded through Ellie was immediate and overwhelming. Each permit approval felt like another vote of confidence. In her vision, another step away from the woman who'd been dismissed at her own Thanksgiving table and towards someone capable of creating something meaningful. "Ruby's blog post about the renovation is getting incredible response," Sam added, looking up from her measurements. "She's documenting the whole process, and people are really connecting with the story." Comments from folks all over Vermont saying, "They can't wait to try authentic, traditional recipes." Ruby Chen had become an unexpected champion, writing weekly updates about Hartwell's kitchen that combined food history with personal narrative. Her blog had transformed from regional restaurant reviews into something more ambitious, a meditation on the value of preserving culinary traditions in an increasingly homogenized food landscape. The afternoon brought a parade of volunteers, neighbors who'd heard about the project through Maple Ridge's efficient gossip network and wanted to contribute. Mrs. Patterson from the church auxiliary arrived with sandwiches for the work crew. Bill Hennessy, who'd retired from plumbing, spent 2 hours explaining the intricacies of commercial kitchen drainage to Sam while refusing payment for his consultation. Even teenagers from the high school stopped by after classes, curious about the transformation taking place in the building they'd passed every day for years without really seeing. "It's like the whole town is invested in making this work," Ellie observed as she and Sam tested recipes in the makeshift kitchen they'd set up in the back room. They'd spent the morning working on her grandmother's pot roast recipe, with Sam suggesting modifications that would allow them to prepare it efficiently for restaurant service while maintaining the slow-cooked richness that made it special. The process of translating family recipes into commercial quantities required careful mathematics, scaling up ingredients while preserving the delicate balance of flavors that made each dish memorable. "Try this," Sam said, offering Ellie a spoonful of gravy that had been simmering for 3 hours. "I used your grandmother's base recipe but added a touch of wine and fresh thyme. Still authentic, but with enough complexity to surprise people." The flavor was perfect, familiar enough to evoke childhood memories, but sophisticated enough to satisfy adult palates. This was the balance they'd been seeking, honoring tradition while acknowledging that food, like everything else, could evolve, without losing its essential character. Frank appeared in the kitchen doorway, drawn by the aroma. "That smells like my mother's Sunday dinner," he said, accepting the taste Sam offered him. His eyes closed briefly as he savored the gravy. But somehow better. "It's the same recipe," Ellie explained. "But Sam understands how to bring out the best in it. She's teaching me that traditional doesn't have to mean primitive." As the afternoon wore on, the building filled with the sounds of construction and conversation, the mingled aromas of cooking and sawdust, the sense of something important taking shape through collective effort. Ellie found herself moving between the dining room where Tommy installed new light fixtures and the kitchen where Sam experimented with her grandmother's apple pie recipe, feeling more purposeful than she had in years. The phone call from Michael came just as they were cleaning up for the day. Ellie almost didn't answer, still raw from their Thanksgiving confrontation, but Frank's encouraging nod convinced her to take the call. "Mom," Michael's voice carried an unfamiliar uncertainty. "Tommy told me about the restaurant. I have to admit, I'm surprised you're actually going through with it." The comment stung, but Ellie found her response came from strength rather than defensiveness. "Why wouldn't I go through with it? Look, I know I said some things at Thanksgiving that probably hurt your feelings, but this seems like such a big risk. What if it doesn't work? What if people don't want traditional food?" Ellie looked around the building that was slowly transforming into her vision. Tommy adjusting a chandelier that would cast warm light over family dinners, Sam perfecting recipes that connected past and present, Frank reviewing financial projections. That proved the business could succeed. "Then I'll have tried something meaningful instead of staying safe," she said quietly. "And I'll have learned that I'm capable of more than I thought." There was a long pause before Michael spoke again. "Maybe I could drive up next weekend, see what you're building." After she hung up, Ellie stood in her future restaurant surrounded by people who believed in her vision, feeling grateful for the hurt that had pushed her toward this moment of possibility. The woman who'd been dismissed as outdated was creating something that honored the past while embracing the future. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, equipment installations, staff training, the 1,000 details that separated good intentions from successful execution. But tonight, Hartwell's kitchen felt less like a dream and more like an inevitable reality, built one board and one recipe at a time by people who understood that some traditions were worth fighting for. 2 weeks before the planned opening, Ellie stood in her completed restaurant kitchen at 5 in the morning, staring at the gleaming commercial equipment that had arrived the day before. The 6-burner range looked massive compared to her home. Stove and the walk-in cooler hummed with an efficiency that made her feel simultaneously grateful and terrified. Everything was ready, permits approved, staff hired, menu finalized, but Ellie felt like an imposter wearing someone else's chef's coat. "Deep breaths," Sam said, appearing beside her with 2 cups of coffee. "It's just cooking. You've been doing this your whole life." "Not like this," Ellie replied, gesturing at the intimidating array of professional equipment. At home, if dinner runs late, Henry just waited patiently. Here, if we're slow with the appetizers, 20 tables full of paying customers start getting annoyed. The practice dinner service they'd planned for tonight would be their first real test. 20 friends and family members experiencing the full Hartwell's kitchen concept from greeting to dessert. Tommy had installed the last light fixtures the evening before, casting warm amber light over dining room tables dressed with checkered tablecloths and mason jar centerpieces. The aesthetic was deliberately homey, designed to make people feel like they were eating Sunday dinner at their grandmother's house. "Menu meeting in 10 minutes, Sam called to the 3 part-time servers they'd hired. Local college students who needed weekend work and had the kind of friendly personalities that fit Ellie's vision of unpretentious hospitality. As the morning progressed, Ellie found herself making lists of everything that could go wrong. What if the timing was off and appetizers arrived after entrees? What if her grandmother's recipes didn't translate well to larger groups? What if people expected something more sophisticated than comfort food served on mismatched vintage plates? The prep work provided some comfort, the familiar rituals of chopping vegetables and seasoning meats grounding her in skills she'd developed over decades. But even these routine tasks felt different when multiplied by 20 servings and timed to restaurant standards. "Behind you," Sam called, carrying a hotel pan of her grandmother's famous stuffing to the walk-in cooler. The kitchen ballet of professional service was still foreign to Ellie, but Sam moved through the space with practiced efficiency, calling out movements and maintaining the constant communication that prevented collisions and chaos. By afternoon, Ellie's nerves had reached a fever pitch. She stood in the dining room, checking table settings for the third time and second-guessing every decision she'd made over the past 4 months. The vintage plates looked shabby rather than charming. The mason jar centerpieces seemed forced and precious. The whole concept felt like an elaborate exercise in self-delusion. "You're overthinking this," Maggie said, appearing in the doorway with her arms full of flowers from her garden. At 71, Maggie had lived through enough community events to recognize pre-performance anxiety when she saw it. "These people love you, Ellie. They want to see you succeed. What if the food isn't good enough? What if I've been fooling myself about my cooking skills?" Maggie set down the flowers and fixed Ellie with the stern expression she'd perfected during 40 years of teaching high school. "Eleanor Rose Hartwell, I have eaten your cooking at every church potluck, community fundraiser, and holiday gathering for 30 years. Your food brings people together. It makes them feel cared for. That's not something you can fake or lose overnight." The first guests arrived at 6 o'clock. Tommy and his girlfriend Sarah, followed by Frank wearing a sport coat Ellie had never seen before, and carrying a bottle of wine that looked expensive enough to signal the importance of the occasion. Ruby Chen appeared with her camera, documenting everything for the blog post that would either celebrate Hartwell's kitchen's debut or memorialize its spectacular failure. For the first hour, everything went smoothly. The appetizers, her grandmother's cheese biscuits with honey butter, emerged from the kitchen on time and received enthusiastic approval. The soup course, a hearty vegetable barley that had sustained her family through countless Vermont winters, earned compliments that made Ellie's chest swell with pride. Then the main course service began, and everything started falling apart. The timing was off. Tables that had ordered at the same time received their entrees 15 minutes apart. The pot roast that had been perfect during testing somehow emerged from the oven dry and tough. Worst of all, the ancient dishwasher that Mrs. Miller had assured them was perfectly functional chose that moment to break down, leaving them with a growing mountain of dirty plates and no way to serve dessert. Ellie stood in the kitchen doorway, watching her friends and family make polite conversation while their dinner grew cold on plates that should have been cleared 20 minutes earlier, and felt the familiar sensation of shrinking inward. She'd been fooling herself. She wasn't a restaurateur. She was a middle-aged widow playing dress-up in a commercial kitchen. "Hey," Sam said, appearing at her elbow. "Kitchen emergencies happen in every restaurant. The question is how we handle them." But Ellie couldn't hear the practical solution in Sam's voice. All she could hear was the confirmation of every doubt she'd harbored about this venture. She excused herself and escaped to the small office Tommy had built in the upstairs space, where she sat on a folding chair and cried the kind of tears that came from deep disappointment and public humiliation. She was still sitting there 20 minutes later when Frank knocked on the doorframe. Without waiting for permission, he entered and settled into the chair across from her makeshift desk. "You know," he said conversationally, "the first time I tried to make Sarah's chocolate cake after she died. I burned it so badly the smoke alarm went off and the neighbors called the fire department." Ellie looked up, surprised by the unexpected story. "I'd watched her make that cake 100 times. I had the recipe memorized. But something about doing it alone, under pressure, made me forget everything I thought I knew." Frank leaned forward, his expression gentle but serious. "The difference between a successful person and an unsuccessful one isn't whether they fail. It's whether they learn from failure or let it defeat them." "This isn't just failure," Ellie said quietly. "This is public failure. Everyone I know watched me mess up the one thing I thought I was good at." "What they watched," Frank said, "was someone brave enough to try something difficult. And what they're doing downstairs right now is washing dishes and rearranging tables and figuring out how to help you succeed." As if summoned by his words, voices drifted up from the dining room. Maggie organizing a dishwashing assembly line, Tommy troubleshooting the broken dishwasher, Sam directing the servers in clearing tables so they could reset for dessert service. When Ellie finally returned to the dining room 30 minutes later, she found her guests had transformed the evening from disaster into community event. Someone had started a sing-along, led by Mrs. Patterson on the old upright piano Tommy had installed in the corner. The teenagers she'd hired as servers were learning dishwashing techniques from retired neighbors who'd rolled up their sleeves. To help. "Speech!" someone called when they saw Ellie appear, and soon the entire room was chanting for her to address the group. Standing before her friends and neighbors, still wearing the chef's coat that felt like costume jewelry, Ellie found words she hadn't planned. "Tonight didn't go the way I hoped it would," she began, earning sympathetic laughter from the crowd. "But watching all of you turn a disaster into something beautiful reminds me why I wanted to open this restaurant in the first place. It's not about perfect service or flawless execution. It's about creating a place where people take care of each other." The applause that followed felt different from polite appreciation. Warmer, more invested, as if everyone in the room had become stakeholders in Hartwell's kitchen's success. As the evening wound down and the last guests hugged their goodbyes, Ellie stood in her restaurant surrounded by friends who'd become family, feeling grateful for the failure that had revealed how much support surrounded her. The opening was still 2 weeks away, but tonight had taught her something more valuable than perfect timing. The difference between performing and belonging, between impressing people and creating community. Sam appeared beside her with a plate of her grandmother's apple pie, the only course that had emerged from the kitchen exactly as planned. "Ready to try again tomorrow?" Sam asked. Ellie took a bite of the pie, tasting the cinnamon and memories of Sunday dinners that had sustained her family through good times and difficult ones. The recipe was perfect, just as it had always been. The execution would improve with practice. "Ready," she said, and meant it. The morning of opening day arrived with crisp October clarity, maples burning amber and scarlet outside Hartwell's kitchen. At 5:30, Ellie stood in the center of her restaurant, hands trembling as she surveyed the space that had consumed 8 months of her life. The old Miller's hardware building had been transformed into something both timeless and alive. Tommy's restoration exposed original brick walls and refinished wide plank floors, while preserving industrial ceiling beams that gave the space honest character. Mismatched wooden tables and chairs created intimate seating areas that felt like someone's dining room. Mason jar pendant lights cast warm pools of illumination, and framed photographs of Vermont farms told stories about the community's agricultural heritage. Behind the pass-through window, Sam Rodriguez prepped vegetables with efficient focus. At 24, Sam had proven everything Ellie hoped for in a sous chef: technically skilled but eager to learn traditional techniques, respectful of recipes. Heritage while streamlining service for professional kitchen operations. "How are you feeling, chef?" Sam called out, using the title that still made Ellie's chest tighten with pride and terror. "Terrified," Ellie admitted, adjusting the chalkboard menu for the 3rd time. The offerings were simple but carefully chosen: maple-glazed acorn squash soup with homemade cornbread, roasted chicken with sage stuffing and apple cider gravy, pot roast with root vegetables, buttermilk biscuits with honey butter, and apple pie made with Morrison's orchard fruit. Frank Morrison's voice came from behind her, warm with gentle humor. "Good terrified or bad terrified?" He wore flannel and jeans instead of his banker's uniform, ready to help however needed. "Both," Ellie replied. "What if nobody comes? What if I've made a terrible mistake?" "Then we'll figure it out," Frank said simply. "One day at a time." Maggie arrived carrying garden flowers, radiating brisk confidence. "Stop fussing with that menu. Half the town is planning to eat here today just to support you." "Half the town?" Ruby's blog post got shared everywhere, plus the Valley News article. "You're famous." Maggie's eyes sparkled. "Patricia Weston even made a lunch reservation." Ellie groaned. Councilwoman Weston had been skeptical from the beginning, preferring upscale establishments for affluent tourists over homestyle places catering to locals. Tommy burst through the back door, carpenter's tool belt replaced by a server's apron. "Are we really doing this?" "We're really doing this," Ellie said, looking around at her chosen family, Sam focused in the kitchen, Tommy adjusting chairs, Maggie arranging flowers, Frank checking coffee makers. At 7 sharp, Ellie unlocked the door and flipped the sign to open. First customers were waiting. Earl and Betty from next door, Jim Patterson from the garage, Mary Sullivan from the insurance office. Local people who wanted to be part of the story from the beginning. The first hour passed in nervous energy and careful attention. Orders came steadily. Sam called preparations from the kitchen, while Tommy served with earnest enthusiasm. The maple squash soup was a hit, rich and warming with perfect sweetness and spice. Roasted chicken emerged golden and fragrant, sage stuffing perfectly moist. Customers lingered, obviously enjoying themselves. By 10:30, Ellie began believing they might actually succeed. That's when the coffee machine died. The ancient espresso machine began making ominous grinding noises. Steam hissed from unexpected places, and suddenly it shuddered to a halt with a decisive clunk. "Chef, we've got a problem," Sam called, but Ellie was already staring helplessly at the silent machine. "Can you fix it?" Tommy asked. "Do I look like I can fix it?" Ellie snapped, morning confidence evaporating as half her drink menu disappeared with the lunch rush still hours away. Every restaurant horror story flooded back. Equipment failures destroying reputations. Opening day debacles ending businesses before they started. Then she looked around at customers enjoying meals, at her team that had worked so hard to make this possible. "We adapt," she said, voice gaining strength. "Sam, how much coffee do we have brewed?" "About 2 pots, plus thermal carafes." "Tommy, go to Miller's Market and buy every bag of good coffee they have, plus French press makers. We'll brew in batches and serve in carafes." "What about lattes and cappuccinos?" Ellie smiled with sudden inspiration. "We offer something better. Coffee with real Vermont maple cream. Fresh whipped cream with maple syrup, served on the side. Call it a Hartwell's Kitchen specialty." Frank stepped forward with admiration. Turn a problem into an opportunity. The next hours tested every aspect of their preparation. Tommy ran errands and bussed tables. Frank helped serve and charmed customers with building history. Maggie appointed herself hostess. Sam worked the kitchen like a conductor, keeping food flowing despite cramped space and jury-rigged coffee system. Ellie moved through it all with calm she didn't entirely feel, greeting customers, solving problems, discovering skills she hadn't known she possessed. When Mrs. Patterson complained about dry chicken, Ellie apologized sincerely, removed the meal from the bill, and brought fresh plate with extra gravy. When they ran short on soup, she quickly improvised hearty bean and vegetable soup from ingredients on hand. The maple cream coffee became an unexpected sensation. Customers loved the rich, sweet addition, several asking if it would be permanent. Ruby Chen, arriving with a photographer, declared it perfect Vermont innovation, taking something traditional and making it uniquely local. At 2 o'clock, Councilwoman Patricia Weston arrived with 2 other council members. Ellie knew this. Meal would be scrutinized more than any critic's review. "Mrs. Weston, welcome to Hartwell's Kitchen," Ellie said with professional warmth. "Mrs. Hartwell," Patricia replied coolly, eyes scanning the dining room. "The renovation turned out better than expected. Very authentic." Patricia ordered pot roast. Her companions chose chicken and soup. Ellie personally ensured every element was perfect. She watched Patricia take her first bite, expression carefully controlled. But Ellie caught the subtle widening of eyes, the thoughtful chewing, then larger second bite. When they rose to leave, Patricia approached Ellie. "Mrs. Hartwell, I owe you an apology. I had concerns about whether this establishment would align with our community development goals, but you're providing exactly what Maple Ridge needs, a gathering place that celebrates local culture while serving genuinely excellent food. Thank you, Councilwoman. That means everything. I'll be back, and I'll be bringing friends. You've created something special." As afternoon wound down, Ellie sat at the counter taking stock. Despite equipment failure, despite fears and inexperience, Hartwell's kitchen had successfully opened. More than that, it had found its voice. Warm, welcoming, authentic, resilient. Frank sat beside her. "How do you feel?" "Like we actually did it," Ellie replied, looking around at her restaurant still full of customers past closing time, filled with comfortable conversation and laughter. "Like this might actually work." Sam emerged from the kitchen, chef's coat stained but face glowing. 68 meals served, 12 takeout orders, approximately 1,000,000 compliments. 3 people asked about catering. Tommy collapsed theatrically. "That was incredible. Did you see how happy people were?" "I saw," Ellie said quietly. "Grandma, Rose would have been proud." 8 months ago, she had been a wounded widow dismissed as outdated. Tonight, she was a restaurant owner surrounded by people who believed in her vision. She had proved traditional didn't mean inferior, that experience had value, that it was never too late to build something meaningful. The broken coffee machine sat silent, a reminder that success came through adaptation rather than perfection. Tomorrow they would repair or replace it. Tomorrow they would refine service, continue the never-ending process of improvement. But tonight, they would celebrate knowing Hartwell's kitchen had found its place in the community, that Eleanor Hartwell had found her place in the world, and that sometimes the most radical act was simply refusing to remain invisible. Outside, October evening settled over Maple Ridge with peaceful beauty. Inside Hartwell's kitchen, the revolution that began with hurt feelings over family dinner had evolved into something larger, a place where tradition and innovation coexisted, where community gathered, and where one woman's determination to prove her worth had created something valuable for everyone. The first day was ending, but the real story was just beginning. 3 months after opening, Hartwell's kitchen faced the kind of problems Ellie had never imagined wanting. By 11:30 on a snowy January morning, every table was occupied. A line of customers waited by the door, stamping slush from their boots, and the phone rang constantly with reservation requests. Sam moved through the cramped kitchen with controlled urgency, calling out orders while Ellie plated the maple-glazed squash soup that had become their signature dish. "We need more servers," Sam announced during a brief lull, wiping sweat from her forehead. "And honestly, we need more kitchen space. I'm running out of room to prep." Ellie nodded, though the thought of expansion made her stomach tighten. Success was supposed to feel triumphant, but instead it felt overwhelming. They had hired 2 part-time servers and a prep cook, but demand continued outpacing their capacity. Ruby's blog coverage had sparked interest from food writers across New England, and weekend reservations were booked 3 weeks in advance. The lunch rush was building when Maggie appeared at the kitchen window with an expression Ellie had learned to recognize, barely contained excitement mixed with concern. "There's a man here from Vermont Life magazine," Maggie announced. "Says he's doing a piece on authentic Vermont dining experiences. He's already ordered and he's taking notes." Ellie's hands stilled on the plate she was garnishing. Vermont Life was serious recognition, the kind of coverage that could transform a local restaurant into a regional destination. It was also the kind of scrutiny that could expose every flaw in their still-evolving operation. "Which table?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. "Corner booth, distinguished-looking gentleman, probably 60s, taking photographs of his food." Through the pass-through window, Ellie spotted him, silver-haired, wearing the kind of expensive, casual clothes that suggested both sophistication and serious disposable income. He was methodically photographing his pot roast from multiple angles, making notes between bites. "How's the food going out?" she asked Sam. "Perfect timing, actually. Everything's running smoothly today." Sam ladled soup into bowls with practiced precision. "Just keep doing what we always do." The advice was sound, but Ellie felt the weight of opportunity and potential disaster in equal measure. This review could establish Hartwell's kitchen as a must-visit destination or expose them as amateurs playing at running a real restaurant. She was so focused on the critic that she almost missed the familiar figure entering through the front door. Michael stood uncertainly by the hostess station, looking around the restaurant with the same evaluating gaze she remembered from Thanksgiving dinner, but without the dismissive confidence. He wore a wool coat that suggested he'd driven up from Boston, and his expression carried something she hadn't seen since he was a boy: nervousness. "Mom?" Tommy appeared at her elbow, following her gaze. "Is that Mike?" "It is." Ellie wiped her hands on her apron, uncertain whether she felt pleased or terrified by her older son's unexpected appearance. Michael approached the kitchen window, his usual composure replaced by something more tentative. "Hi, Mom. I hope it's okay that I just showed up. I tried calling, but the line was always busy." "We've been busy," Ellie replied carefully, studying his face for signs of the condescension that had started this entire journey. "I can see that." Michael looked around the dining room, taking in the full tables, the comfortable atmosphere, the obvious satisfaction of customers enjoying their ins. This is really something. I had no idea. "What brings you to Vermont?" The question came out more formal than she intended, but months of hurt and determination had built walls that wouldn't come down easily. "I wanted to see what you'd built, and I wanted to apologize." Michael's voice was quiet enough that she had to lean closer to hear him over the kitchen noise. "What I said at Thanksgiving was wrong. Cruel, really. I've been thinking about it for months, especially after Ruby's article was shared around my office." Ellie felt something shift in her chest, a loosening of tension she hadn't realized she'd been carrying. "You saw Ruby's piece?" "My colleagues were talking about this amazing traditional Vermont restaurant, and when I saw the name..." Michael's smile was self-deprecating. "I realized my mother had become famous for exactly the things I'd criticized her for." Before Ellie could respond, Sam appeared with a concerned expression. "Chef, the critic is asking to speak with you. He wants to know about the recipe heritage." The timing was impossible. Her son's apology, the magazine critic, the lunch, rush building to its peak. But as Ellie looked at Michael's face, she saw something that gave her hope. Genuine respect replacing the dismissive attitude that had wounded her so deeply. "Can you wait?" she asked Michael. "I need to handle this, but we should talk." "I'll wait as long as you need," he replied. "I cleared my whole afternoon." Ellie approached the critics' table with the same calm professionalism that had carried her through opening day crises. "I'm Eleanor Hartwell, the owner and head chef. I understand you have questions about our recipes." "James Morrison, Vermont Life," he said, standing and extending his hand. "This pot roast is extraordinary. The depth of flavor suggests techniques that go back generations." "My grandmother's recipe, actually. She ran a boarding house during the Depression, so she knew how to make affordable cuts of meat into something memorable." "Would you mind if I asked about your background? This level of skill doesn't happen overnight." For the next 10 minutes, Ellie found herself telling the story she'd grown comfortable sharing: Rose's influence, the boarding house heritage, the way traditional techniques could create extraordinary flavors from simple ingredients. James Morrison listened with the focused attention of someone who understood food culture, asking thoughtful questions about preparation methods and ingredient sourcing. "One more question," he said as their conversation wound down. "What drove you to open this restaurant? It's unusual for someone to start their first restaurant at, if you don't mind me asking." "I'm 58, Ellie said without hesitation, "and I opened this restaurant because my son told me my cooking was outdated." She gestured toward Michael, who was sitting at the counter looking simultaneously proud and mortified. Turns out he was wrong. James Morrison's eyes lit up with obvious delight. "That's a wonderful story. Family, tradition, proving yourself. Our readers will love that angle. After the critic left, promising a feature story in the spring issue, Ellie finally had time to sit with Michael. Tommy joined them, and for the first time in months, the three of them were together without the weight of unspoken resentment. "I owe you both an apology," Michael said, his corporate confidence replaced by genuine humility. "I was arrogant and thoughtless. I thought I knew better because I lived in the city, because I was exposed to different kinds of food. But watching people eat here today, seeing how happy they are, understanding what you've actually accomplished." "You thought you were helping," Tommy said, though his tone still carried protective edge. "You just didn't think about how it would sound." "That's no excuse." Michael turned to Ellie. "Mom, what you've built here is incredible. This isn't just a restaurant, it's a community gathering place. People aren't just eating your food, they're experiencing something that makes them feel connected to this place, to each other." Ellie felt tears threatening, but managed to keep her voice steady. "I wanted to prove that traditional cooking still had value, that the things Grandma Rose taught me weren't obsolete." "They're not obsolete. They're timeless." Michael looked around the restaurant again, his appreciation obviously genuine. "I've eaten at some of the best restaurants in Boston, and none of them made me feel the way this place does. This is real hospitality, real cooking, real community." Frank appeared at their table, having finished his lunch break from the bank. "Michael, good to see you. Your mother's been working herself to death, but she's created something remarkable here." "I can see that," Michael replied, "and I understand you've been instrumental in making it happen." Frank's relationship with Ellie had deepened over the months of building the restaurant, but they'd kept things private, professional. Now, seeing Michael's respectful tone, Frank relaxed slightly. "Your mother did this herself," Frank said. "I just helped with the paperwork." As they talked, Sam approached with news that would complicate their growing success. "Chef, I need to tell you something. I've been getting calls from restaurants in Burlington and Montpelier. They're offering me head chef positions." The statement hung in the air like a challenge. Sam had become essential to Hartwell's kitchen's operations, her culinary school training perfectly complementing Ellie's traditional knowledge. Losing her would be devastating, but Ellie also understood the appeal of advancement opportunities. "Are you interested?" Ellie asked, though her heart sank at the possibility. "I don't know," Sam admitted. "I love working here, love what we're doing, but these are significant career opportunities. Head chef positions at establishments that could really advance my resume." Michael leaned forward with sudden interest. "What would it take to keep you here? Partnership stake? Better salary? Professional development opportunities?" His business instincts were kicking in, and Ellie found herself grateful for his different perspective. This was exactly the kind of strategic thinking she struggled with, balancing personal relationships with business necessities. "We'll figure something out," Ellie said to Sam. "You're too important to lose, and you deserve opportunities for growth." As the afternoon wound down and the lunch crowd dispersed, Ellie reflected on the strange convergence of success and complications. The magazine feature would bring more attention, more customers, more pressure to expand. Sam's career ambitions would require creative solutions. The restaurant's growing reputation was creating opportunities she'd never imagined, but also responsibilities that sometimes felt overwhelming. But looking around at her restaurant, at Michael's newfound respect, at the community that had embraced her vision, Ellie felt something she hadn't experienced since Robert's death. The deep satisfaction of work that mattered, of proving that experience and tradition could create something valuable and lasting. The revolution that had begun with hurt feelings over a family dinner had evolved into something larger than revenge or vindication. It had become about creating meaning, building community, and proving that it was never too late to discover what you were truly capable of accomplishing. November arrived with the kind of crystalline beauty that made Vermont postcards famous, and Ellie stood in her restaurant kitchen preparing for the one-year anniversary celebration that would recreate the Thanksgiving menu that had started everything. The irony wasn't lost on her. Exactly 1 year ago, she had been a wounded widow serving the same dishes to ungrateful family. Tonight, those recipes would be the centerpiece of a sold-out celebration attended by food critics, local dignitaries, and the community that had embraced her impossible dream. The menu board displayed the familiar offerings that had launched her journey: maple-glazed acorn squash soup, roasted turkey with sage stuffing, cranberry sauce, and apple pie. But everything else had changed. Sam Rodriguez, now officially a partner with a 20% stake in the restaurant, moved through the expanded kitchen with the confidence of someone who had found her calling. The cramped space had been renovated during the summer closure, doubling the prep area and adding professional equipment that made their original setup look amateur. "How are you feeling about tonight?" Sam asked, checking the ovens where 6 turkeys roasted to golden perfection. "Like I'm coming full circle," Ellie replied, taste-testing the cranberry sauce that had sparked Michael's dismissive comments a year earlier. The recipe remained unchanged. Rose's handwritten instructions followed exactly, but everything around it had been transformed. Frank appeared in the kitchen doorway, wearing the navy suit he reserved for special occasions. Over the month since opening, their relationship had evolved from professional support to something deeper and more complicated. He had been patient with her need to focus on the restaurant, understanding that this year had been about proving herself as much as building a business. "The dining room looks beautiful," he said, his voice carrying the warmth she had grown to depend on. Tommy outdid himself with the decorations. Through the pass-through window, Ellie could see the result of her younger son's artistic vision. Autumn leaves and small pumpkins adorned every table, while photographs of the restaurant's first year covered one wall: opening day chaos, the Vermont Life feature, community events they had hosted. The space felt like a celebration of journey rather than just destination. "Any word from Michael?" Frank asked quietly. "His flight lands at 4. He's bringing Sarah and the kids." Ellie's voice carried a mixture of nervousness and anticipation. Michael's January apology had been sincere, but tonight would test whether their relationship could truly heal. "He wants to say something tonight, apparently, some kind of public statement." The thought made her stomach flutter with anxiety. Michael's corporate communication skills could be double-edged. His words had started this journey with their careless cruelty, but they could also carry weight and influence she didn't entirely trust. Ruby Chen arrived early, as had become her tradition, carrying camera equipment and the excited energy of someone documenting a story she had helped create. "Ellie, you look fantastic. Ready for your victory lap?" "I don't know about victory," Ellie replied, though she couldn't suppress a smile. "Maybe just completion." "Don't be modest. Do you know how many people tried to get reservations tonight? I had calls from food writers in Boston and New York. You've become a destination." The observation was both thrilling and sobering. Success had brought opportunities she'd never imagined: a cookbook deal from a regional publisher, catering requests for weddings and corporate events, even inquiries about franchising the concept. Each opportunity carried the same tension: how to grow without losing the authenticity that made Hartwell's kitchen special. Guests began arriving at 5:30, and Ellie moved between kitchen and dining room with practiced ease. The crowd was a fascinating mix: local farmers and business owners who had supported her from the beginning, food industry professionals, drawn by the restaurant's growing reputation, and friends who had watched her transform from grieving widow to confident entrepreneur. Councilwoman Patricia Weston arrived with the mayor and 2 state legislators, their presence lending official weight to the celebration. Patricia had become an unexpected ally, often bringing visiting officials to experience what she called authentic Vermont hospitality. Michael's entrance created a small stir, the prodigal son returning to witness his mother's triumph. He looked nervous but determined, scanning the room before approaching Ellie with the careful attention of someone who understood the significance of the moment. "Mom, this is incredible," he said, embracing her with genuine warmth. "I'm so proud of what you've accomplished." "Thank you for coming," Ellie replied, meaning it more than he probably realized. His presence tonight represented forgiveness and acceptance that had taken months to achieve. As dinner service began, Ellie watched the same dishes that had been dismissed as outdated receive appreciative attention from sophisticated palates. The maple squash soup earned murmurs of approval from the food critics' table. The turkey, carved tableside by Tommy with theatrical flair, drew applause from diners who understood they were experiencing something authentic and unrepeatable. When the main course was finished and coffee was being served, Michael stood and asked for attention. The dining room quieted, and Ellie felt her heart rate accelerate with uncertain anticipation. "A year ago, I said some thoughtless things to my mother about her cooking," Michael began, his voice carrying across the room with practiced confidence. "I suggested her traditional recipes were outdated, that she needed to modernize to stay relevant." A few uncomfortable chuckles rippled through the audience, but Michael's expression remained serious. "I was wrong in every possible way. What I failed to understand was that my mother wasn't preserving old recipes. She was maintaining a connection to something timeless. She wasn't stuck in the past. She was honoring traditions that had sustained families and communities for generations." Ellie felt tears threatening as her son continued, his words carrying the weight of genuine recognition and respect. "Hartwell's kitchen represents everything valuable about Vermont: authenticity, community, the understanding that some things don't need to be improved, just appreciated. My mother took my criticism and turned it into motivation to prove that traditional cooking, done with skill and love, is never outdated." The room erupted in applause, and Ellie found herself overwhelmed by the journey from hurt to healing, from invisible widow to recognized entrepreneur, from family discord to public reconciliation. As the evening wound down and guests lingered over coffee and conversation, Ellie stood in her kitchen surveying the evidence of a successful celebration. The same recipes that had sparked her son's dismissive comments had earned standing ovations from food industry professionals. The restaurant that began as angry revenge had evolved into something larger, a gathering place, a destination, a proof that experience and tradition could thrive in the modern world. Frank appeared beside her, offering a cup of coffee and the comfortable presence she had grown to cherish. "So, what's next?" Ellie considered the question, looking around at the restaurant that had transformed her life. "More of the same, I think. Keep cooking, keep serving people, keep proving that some things are worth preserving." The revolution that had begun with hurt feelings had reached its completion, not through grand gestures, but through the quiet satisfaction of work well done, community well served, and traditions faithfully maintained while remaining vibrantly alive. Spring had arrived in Maple Ridge with the subtle persistence that characterized Vermont seasons, and Ellie stood in her kitchen garden, hands deep in rich soil as she planted herbs that would grace summer menus. The morning sun felt warm on her back, a promise of renewal that matched the contentment settling over her life like a well-worn shawl. 18 months had passed since opening day, and Hartwell's kitchen had found its rhythm. The breakfast rush had become a gathering point for local contractors and retirees. The lunch crowd mixed tourists with office workers, and dinner service attracted couples celebrating anniversaries and families marking milestones. The restaurant had become what Ellie had dreamed of, not just a business, but a cornerstone of community life. "The New York Times wants to schedule a visit," Sam announced, appearing at the garden gate with a cup of coffee and the morning mail. At 25, Sam carried herself with the confidence of someone who had found both professional success and personal purpose. The partnership arrangement had worked better than either of them had expected, combining Ellie's traditional knowledge with Sam's contemporary training. The Times? Ellie sat back on her heels, brushing soil from her hands. Are you serious? Food Critic wants to include us in a piece about authentic regional American restaurants. Ruby thinks it could put us on the national map. Sam's excitement was obvious, but her tone carried a question. How do you feel about that level of attention? It was a conversation they'd been having more frequently. Success had brought opportunities that challenged Ellie's original vision of a simple neighborhood restaurant. The cookbook deal had led to requests for television appearances. Food Network had inquired about featuring them in a documentary series. A restaurant group from Boston had made a serious offer to franchise the concept. I feel like we need to remember why we started this, Ellie said, standing and accepting the coffee Sam offered. It was never about becoming famous. It was about proving that traditional cooking had value, that community gathering places mattered. But we can do both, can't we? Stay true to our values while reaching more people? The question had been keeping Ellie awake at night. Growth was seductive, but she had seen too many successful restaurants lose their soul in pursuit of expansion. The challenge was distinguishing between opportunities that aligned with their mission and those that would compromise it. Frank's truck pulled into the driveway, and Ellie felt the familiar flutter of anticipation that had never quite faded, even after months of courtship that had progressed with Vermont-appropriate deliberation. He emerged carrying a bouquet of daffodils and wearing the expression of someone with important news. "Good morning, ladies," he said, kissing Ellie's cheek with the comfortable intimacy that had developed between them. "Beautiful day for gardening, and for making decisions about the future." "What kind of decisions?" Sam asked, but her knowing smile suggested she suspected. Frank pulled a small velvet box from his jacket pocket, his usual banker's composure, replaced by nervous excitement. The kind that requires careful consideration of assets, liabilities, and long-term growth potential. Even his proposal was delivered in financial terms, which made Ellie laugh despite her racing heart. "Frank Morrison, are you trying to merge our operations?" "I'm suggesting a partnership that would benefit both parties," he replied, opening the box to reveal a simple diamond ring that caught the morning sunlight. With shared resources, complementary skills, and a commitment to mutual support through market fluctuations. "That's the most romantic business proposal I've ever heard," Sam said, grinning widely. Ellie looked at the ring, then at Frank's face, seeing past his nervous humor to the genuine love and respect that had grown between them. "What about the restaurant? What about my independence?" "The restaurant is yours," Frank said seriously. "Your vision, your recipes, your success. I'm not asking to change anything about what you've built. I'm asking to be part of what comes next." What came next arrived that afternoon in the form of Michael's family, visiting for the weekend with news of their own. Sarah was pregnant with their third child, and they were considering a move back to Vermont. Michael's Boston marketing firm had offered him the opportunity to open a Vermont satellite office, focusing on sustainable business and agricultural clients. "We want our kids to grow up somewhere with community," Michael explained as they sat around one of the restaurant's corner tables, sharing an early dinner before the evening rush. "Somewhere with places like this, where people know each other's names and food has stories behind it." Ellie watched her grandson color while her granddaughter helped Tommy arrange flowers on tables, seeing the continuation of family traditions in new forms. The child who had once dismissed her cooking now wanted his children to experience the sense of belonging that came from community connection. "There's something else," Michael said, his voice carrying the careful tone of someone making a significant offer. "I've been thinking about ways to help the restaurant expand without losing its authenticity. What if we developed a line of prepared foods? Your soups and sauces, maybe some of the baked goods, available in local markets with the story behind them?" The proposal was thoughtful, respecting both the restaurant's reputation and Ellie's desire to reach more people without compromising quality. It would allow them to grow while maintaining the intimate atmosphere that made Hartwell's kitchen special. As evening approached and the restaurant filled with dinner guests, Ellie found herself surrounded by the evidence of her transformation. The scared widow who had retreated to her kitchen after a family argument had become a confident businesswoman, community leader, and soon-to-be bride. The outdated recipes that had sparked her son's criticism now anchored a successful restaurant that preserved tradition while embracing innovation. Tommy appeared with champagne as the last dinner customers lingered over dessert. Are we celebrating the engagement, the Times review, the business expansion, or just surviving another day? In the restaurant business? All of it, Ellie replied, accepting the ring from Frank and sliding it onto her finger with the same deliberate care she brought to seasoning soup. We're celebrating the fact that sometimes the best recipes for happiness are the ones that get passed down, adapted slightly for new circumstances, but never abandoned. Ruby Chen materialized with her camera, documenting the moment with the dedication of someone who understood she was witnessing the conclusion of a story that had captured readers' imaginations. "This is perfect," she said, snapping photos of the extended family gathered around the table. The woman who proved that traditional values could thrive in the modern world, finding love and success while never forgetting where she came from. As the evening wound down and the restaurant emptied, Ellie walked through the dining room one more time, straightening chairs and checking that everything was ready for tomorrow's breakfast service. The space felt alive with the memories of countless meals shared, celebrations marked, and relationships nurtured. Her grandmother's recipes had become the foundation for something larger than she had ever imagined. Not just a restaurant, but a place where tradition and innovation could coexist, where community could gather, and where the simple act of sharing food could create lasting connections. The revolution that had begun with hurt feelings over a family dinner had evolved into something sustainable and meaningful. Tomorrow would bring new challenges: the Times review, expansion decisions, wedding planning, the ongoing work of maintaining excellence while growing responsibly. But tonight, surrounded by family and looking toward a future built on the foundation of the past, Ellie Hartwell knew that some recipes for success never went out of style. They just required the courage to keep cooking, one meal at a time, with love as the essential ingredient that made everything else possible. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.